So I'll try to give you a little bit of overview of my work in the area and maybe how it might relate to some of the experiences that you have in your own lives. And try to come at the end with maybe some words of wisdom from some of my clients. I find my clients are the ones who teach me an awful lot about their experiences and what has helped them and maybe what might be helpful for you as well. Being in the university system, you know, I always do the theory stuff, so I don't want to bore you, but I do find with some of my clients, if they have words to describe their experiences, it's helpful. It's helpful to be able to name something and then kind of wrap your head around it. So I do have some information first before we go into some of the suggestions and ideas. I really welcome at the end of the presentation question answers if you want to bring a topic up for discussion, whatever you want to do. I think Susan did say the only caveat is if you have a question or want to make a comment, you need to use the microphone. So, and we also welcome, I guess we're live streaming as well, so we welcome to people who are with us in Cyberland. Okay, make sure the clicker works, Darcy. There you go. So just a little bit about my background. I'm originally from Florida. I did the other reverse direction. Most people go to Florida, and I came from Florida to here. And I love living here, except in January, February, it gets a little dicey. But my background is that I worked as a nurse. I was what's called an advanced practice nurse in the States, working mostly with cancer and also with hospice care, but I did several years of neurology prior to that as well. Things have changed a lot since I was in active practice in neurology. I'm also a registered social worker. A lot of our students who are in the program in thanatology have those backgrounds and they want to do clinical work, so it's very helpful to have the clinical background to kind of be part of that teaching experience. So when we think of loss, this is my picture. This to me is a representation of what is loss. And I think if you've ever shattered glass or broken something that, you know, goes into a million pieces, theoretically you could get super glue and you could put it back together again, but even if you put all the pieces together, it would never look the same. And to me, that's the definition of what is a loss. When something occurs in your life and you know it'll never be the same again, no matter what. You may adjust, you may grow, you may change, but you will never be the same person as a result of this experience. And that's how I define what a loss actually is. In my background, obviously I did a lot of work with hospice care and palliative care and oncology. When I started doing therapy work here in London after completing my graduate training in counseling psychology, I began working with couples going through infertility treatment. And as I was listening to these couples, they were grieving, but there was no death per se, but I kept thinking, this is the language of loss that I'm hearing. This is grief. And I started hearing other types of use of these terms with grief, not associated with death, but with other types of loss. If you remember about 4 or 5 years ago when we had the economic downturn and our Ford plant closed, and there was a huge spike in unemployment in London, I was really busy because a lot of the people who lost their jobs were grieving. They were grieving their identities, they were grieving the loss of their employment, the roles they had, and their income as well. So the language of loss and grief doesn't necessarily mean it's just about death. It's about losses of many kinds, and grief is a process not that immobilizes us, although it can. Grief is actually the process whereby we heal and we grow and we evolve from being exposed to these types of loss experiences. So I think all of us can look and say, 10 years ago, we never thought we'd be sitting in this room, we never thought we'd be here. You know, change happens, and things don't happen as we predict them to happen, and that's life. If you think about things in the physical environment, the physical world, there's really no example of things remaining the same. The seasons change, the weather changes, the cells in our bodies change. So really, the person that's standing here before you now, other than my neurons, is completely different because the cells in my body are different cells than they were a year ago, except for my neurons. So life is really about change and growth and transition, and we have a hard time with that because we really like things to stay the same. This change and transition piece is not something we're necessarily comfortable with. So I want to set that as just kind of hold that for a minute. our current demographic trends, there's no mistaking here, we kind of know some of these. We live longer. I think the average life expectancy now in Canada for men is, I think, 82, and for women around 84, 85, and that's average life expectancy. So, I mean, we have many people living much longer than that. And over that time, we're exposed to a lot more life experiences than we might have been if we had a younger life expectancy. My father is now 90 years old. He has gone to 7 funerals in the last 5 years and done the eulogy for most of them because they were all his best friends. So his last best friend died just 6 months ago. And so for my father, who never would have expected this to happen, he's become very familiar with loss and grief and letting go. And that's not language that he's necessarily comfortable speaking, but something that really has been imposed upon him because he's gotten older and has had to say goodbye to people he really cared about. So we also live longer with chronic health conditions. One of the things, my father, when he was in his 50s, was diagnosed with the Clark level 4 melanoma. For anybody who's got a medical background, that's bad news. Melanoma is a highly invasive skin cancer. Usually upon diagnosis, it's already spread. The fact that my father had what they call a level 4 was really a death sentence, but they did radical surgery and treatment, and my father is now 90 years old. Had this been even 10 years before, my father probably would not have survived because he wouldn't have had that treatment. So I think of the issues that my father has gone through now. He's had a pacemaker, he's had many health conditions. They've all been managed and treated. And so to get to the age of 90, the price he's paid is that he now has to manage a lot of these conditions. And that's what a lot of us face in this, in this room, that the price of living longer is that we're managing things and having to deal with medical conditions that before we might not have had to manage as we would have. So I think a lot of people, we just did away with mandatory retirement at the university. A lot of people at 65, you're just getting started, right? And so a lot of people used to have to end their productive working lives, but at 65 or a mandatory retirement, they were still fresh and good and feeling kind of laid out to pasture before they were ready. And so I think these are demographic trends that are really just in the last 15 years becoming very pronounced for us. I'm part of the baby boom generation, so we're getting older, and we're going to hit up into our senior years at a time when birth control came into effect. So here we had this group of people my age and in my generation all here, and we all had birth control and had 1 or 2 kids, and they're supposed to support all of us. So that's what we're going to be facing in the next little while, and why we're trying to plan health care around some of those issues. Some statistics to consider. I have to do stats because I'm from the university, so you guys expect stats. You know, I have to do this. So about 747,000 Canadians suffer from some type of dementia, not just Alzheimer's, but some type of dementia. And about a little over half of this group would be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. That's a lot. That's a big number, right? So about 60% of people in long-term care facilities have Alzheimer's disease. 1 in 5 people with Parkinson's will eventually go on to develop Alzheimer's as well, or some form of cognitive dementia. So we're looking at some pretty big stats, and we're looking at a growing issue, you know, that's going to concern all of us at some point in time, I think. So you've parked this and parked that, and now I'm going to bring in grief and bereavement. So since I started working in the field many years ago, grief and how we view grief and loss has changed tremendously. When I was in nursing school, it was Kubler-Ross, it was the stages, we all could name them. And that's kind of, you know, gone by the wayside now to look at really the research that's blossomed and developed about grief and how people really do experience grief. So when I was in nursing school, we were taught that we form attachment bonds to the people that we love, and when an attachment bond is broken through death, that triggers the grief response. Well, then some researchers in the mid-90s came up and said, you know, the relationship doesn't necessarily end. I mean, for many of us who have lost loved ones, you'll often still have conversations with them. You'll often still feel their presence with you. The relationship actually doesn't end, and the research now kind of says death may end a life, but not a relationship. So that meant that if we looked at grief as a broken attachment bond, that doesn't necessarily work anymore. So a different way of looking at grief is actually thinking, what is lost? What is really lost? And when I was doing some research on this topic about 8 or 9 years ago, this made sense to me, that what we actually lose is how we view the world and how we view ourselves, and how we view other people as well. And I came across the work of Ronnie Janoff Bowman, wrote a text called Shattered Assumptions. And I found this to be really on target, that this is what we lose. That yes, we do lose people we love, but we also lose parts of ourselves. And we also lose the world as we once knew it to be and expected it to be. That these losses are hard to name sometimes, but they're very real. And these are often the losses that trigger our grief. So there's 3 basic assumptions. If we look at our assumptive world, we think about how we view the world and how we view other people. We think about how we expect things should happen and should work, and how we think of ourselves as well. So I'll give an example. So maybe one of the basic beliefs would be that basically the world's a good place and people are generally trustworthy, right? So that might be an assumption that many of us were raised with. Most people mean well. Another one might be how things should work, our sense of justice and fairness. So one of the things I know I was taught, if you work hard, you'll be rewarded, right? If you're a good person, good will eventually come to you. So kind of the golden rule, that was a lot of what I was brought up with. And then the third one is how we view ourselves, and that maybe I basically think of myself as a good person, I'm basically competent, and I have intrinsic worth and value. And I think in Canadian society, we do value the worth of individuals, and that's a real tenet of who we are. And that's where some of the new legislation on assisted suicide is coming in, that does our basic view of the value and worth of individuals get changed by bringing in legislation for assisted suicide. And I think that's some of the rub that people are, and concern that some people are experiencing with that. So if you think about these basic assumptions, think about maybe 10 years ago. How did you view people in general? How did you view how life was going to unfold? How many of you in this room, instead of now planning your retirement, are planning caregiving arrangements? And how many of you expected to be doing that, right? None. So I have a client right now in my practice. She's in her mid-50s. Her husband has been diagnosed young, and they had children. The last one is just now starting into university at home, and she's piecemeal caregiving arrangements in the home for her husband. And all of her friends in this age group are planning their vacations, their big retirement trips, the kids' graduations, and she is planning caregivers and buying adult diapers. And she comes and says, none of my friends could possibly even imagine what I go through in a day. She's like, get up in the morning, I never know, is he going to be up and wanting breakfast, or is he going to come in with his pants on his head? And she said to try to explain this to people, there's no way they could possibly imagine this. And this is certainly not how she expected the world was going to be. So her assumptions about the world have really been completely upended. And how they had planned for their retirement and they had planned for their time when their kids had left home is now completely changed. And actually 2 of the kids are trying to stay close to home to help mom out with caregiving instead of traveling and doing the education piece that they really wanted to do or that they had planned to do. So their worlds have been changed as well. If you think of how you view yourself, not anybody in this room, of course, feels any guilt whatsoever at not being able to do it all. That we can't do it all, but I think the expectation on ourselves is that we are going to be able to be the loving, caregiving person for our loved one until we lose patience, until we're exhausted, until we say that one thing that we wish we could take back but we can't. And that's really hard to admit, that how I view myself is maybe different from how I actually am because I'm exhausted or because I'm overwhelmed or because I just don't know how to do this anymore. Are we okay with the door? Okay, so I hear talking back there, so I didn't know if it's distracting. So I think when we look at any type of significant loss to any of those assumptions, causes our whole world and how we view the world to be shattered, to be crumbled. And I think that's what causes us to feel grief. And we often don't recognize it because grief always needs to have a body associated with it, right? that, we're grieving because somebody has died. But sometimes we're grieving when someone's living. And sometimes that grief is so profound but unnamed, and we don't know what to do with that. So I do think the death of a loved one obviously has great potential to shatter our assumptive world. We build our lives around the people that we love. But there are other types of losses that can really trigger this grief response in a very significant way. You relearn the world. How many of you now have learned all sorts of things that you never thought you'd ever want to know or need to know, right? Your learning has been completely different than what you ever thought it was going to be. And that's your reality, and that's not what you had planned. So while you have adapted and adjusted, you've had to let go. And it's that letting go piece that starts to mount up over periods of time. So this is my premise, and this is where a lot of my research has been based. The book Counting Our Losses is really about dealing with non-death type grief and loss. And these are losses that we live with, what we call the living losses. So I think sometimes what dies is really not a person. What dies is what's inside of us. And maybe that person and what that person has been to us and what that person is now, we have to let go of the person we once loved and knew, and the person that is still with us but is a different person altogether to us. And we are different in relation to that person. So I hear a lot, probably one of the more common things that I discuss with clients coming in with these types of issues relates to, you're in a marriage, but now your relationship is more like parent-child. And you're not really in a relationship as spouses, but you are a spouse. So what are you? And not wanting to be denigrating to the person that you love, but the reality is that you've had to shift a lot of the responsibilities so that you're the one who's having to be responsible for the day-to-day functioning of another person who has been your equal up to this point in time. I look at it this way too, that you'll have groups of people who will be dealing with the same type of loss. Creeping. Same type of loss, but not really. So you might sit with other caregivers in this room or with other family members dealing with Alzheimer's, and you're describing completely different pictures. So while you can understand that loss affects all of us in different ways, so do one type of loss doesn't necessarily affect us all the same way. It's really, hi. All right. So, one experience is not necessarily going to be the same as another, but there'll be commonalities. That's why you're all here. You're not alone. When you're in your homes and when you're reflecting on all of this and having to go through your daily routine, it's very lonely for many people. In here, you're not alone. So even though the person sitting next to you might be dealing with Alzheimer's, but maybe in a very different way than you are, but there's still a commonality of uncertainty, of life not going as you had planned it, and of your life now unfolding in ways that really this is now new territory for you. There's no script for this. There's no retirement plan for this. There's no, here's how it's going to happen. And that's part of the problem, is you never know. So I think what happens to us is we have this idea of what the world should be, and it helps us to feel a sense of security, feel a sense of, okay, I can put one foot in front of the other. Tomorrow I'm going to open the door, the newspaper is going to be there, I can get in my car, I know I'm supposed to be at work, I have coffee. We sort of have this routine, and the familiar is sort of a safe place for us. And what happens if you get up in the morning and you have no idea what's going to greet you? What happens if you go to bed not knowing if you're going to be up 5 times or if you're going to be able to sleep through the night? And what does that do to you, right? So these are places where you're in constant flux and change, and this constant flux and change keeps you off balance. You can never really adjust completely until you're having to adjust to something else again. What's important too is that not everybody's going to approach what they're dealing with in the same way, that it's very subjective, but it doesn't mean somebody's stronger than another. Each of us has our vulnerabilities, each of us has our place that's going to be harder than another. Some people, the idea of dependency, the idea of leaning on someone else is not that big of a deal because you've had a lifetime of doing that, that's been acceptable, but for others that's just something I could never tolerate. So it's very subjective how we experience these events and losses, both for people who are family members and caregivers, and for the person who's also dealing with the actual disease itself. I find it interesting, this is a funny comparison. My mother died of metastatic cancer. Now, when my mother was losing some functionality and she was unable to do things for herself, we took care of my mom at home, my sister and I. And my mom absolutely loved the fact that I would give her a bath in bed. She just thought this was, and she would purr. She'd say, "Oh, this is just wonderful." And she was very gracious about it. If this had been my father, he'd be telling me to go away and throwing the pan of water at me. So, I mean, it's very individual personalities. So taking care of my mother was one thing because she really loved the attention, and she didn't mind that we were, caregiving for her. If this was my father, he would hate every minute of it. So there's a lot of dynamics and changes. My sister and I are like bookends. I'm the caregiver type. I'm the one who's the counselor and the nurse and the tutor. She's a manager. She does business stuff. And so for her, the idea of doing some of this hands-on care was really not something that she was in for, but she was really good at managing who was coming on what days and how we were going to reimburse the insurance for all the different medical. That was her thing. She did the thank you notes, she did the organization for the schedule, and I was the one who did the bed baths. It was kind of funny how we worked that out. When my mom died, we both grieved. We both grieved the losses along the way as mom lost traction with different areas. But we grieved very differently. I grieved in my emotions. I needed to talk. She needed to be busy. And that was really her coping. So it didn't mean she wasn't grieving. It just meant that her way of grieving was very different than mine. Click. There you go. So I think of three central areas that are affected by loss, and these are areas that probably hit us at a very core place. And the first is our relationships. Really, our sense of meaningful connection with others defines who we are. We're really much, how we attach and how we relate to others and our ability to form relationships that are meaningful, that's a huge piece of who we are. So at what point do we change the meaning in a relationship with someone? At what point do our relationships with other people who can't understand what we're going through change? All of that changes. So that's a big piece. And then the next one is finances, because it's not cheap. You're dealing with equipment, you're dealing with placement, you're dealing with trying to get care. You're also dealing with other issues, maybe loss of income. I know the one client I described earlier, her husband was working full-time when he was diagnosed, and he had to quit his employment early. He's not 65, he's in his 50s, so his pension wasn't even really kicking in as well. So finances are a big issue. I've had 3 young widows have to declare bankruptcy because they hadn't planned. They were young, and you don't think about something like this happening when you're younger, and it can. So finances are a very big deal, and it's not about money, it's about security, and it's about feeling like you have some control over your life. So when this piece goes out of control, it's huge, and it's hard for people to understand often how big this piece can be. We often don't like to talk about money, right? So I think the loss of health, and this has to do with both caregivers and people who are dealing with the diagnosis, that you're dealing with the loss of ability to do things that you want to do and the way you want to do them. So it's just like, my father, if I ever had to give him a bath, I think he would rather shoot me rather than let me come at him with a sponge. The loss of health for my father is going to be a very difficult challenge because his independence means so much to him, versus my mother, her loss of friends and her loss of connection would have been a much bigger loss than her loss of ability to do things with her health. But they were all 3 affected here. So you can think in your lives these areas and how they're being affected on a day-by-day basis. The concerns that you have to deal with, the things you're having to juggle, and it's all there kind of wrapped around itself in a spiral circle for many people. So I think what happens is we're trying to find meaning. Okay, so if this is now life and I can't predict what's going to happen, I don't know what tomorrow holds, and I don't know how this is going to play out. I know eventually how this is probably going to play out, but I don't know for sure. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of confusion too about decision making. So is this the time I should look at placement or not? Should I be bringing somebody into the house or not? Should I sign up for an activity because the distraction might be good or not? But you never know. And these are not decisions that would have been hard, several years ago. These would have been easy decisions. And now everything is a decision. So it makes everything more what I call arduous. It's just more work to have to think about just day by day by day by day. You guys getting tired as I'm talking? Okay. So I'm going to give you some words. And these are defined constructs in research. So I'm going to give you words to use, and I think this might be helpful. When I give talks to professionals, I say these are words that are going to be really helpful for you with your patients and your clients. So the key element for all of these types, they're all non-death type losses, and the key element is that people are disenfranchised. Often it's not recognized. You may look okay, but not be okay. For a lot of people, they say if I'd lost a limb, it would have been easier. If my loved one had died, it would be easier. And then they say, I'm sorry I said that. But it's because often the experience of what you're going through on a daily basis goes unacknowledged, and often by ourselves as well. If you think about when someone dies, you have rituals. We sort of know how to be with people, sort of. I mean, our society's not great at this, but we'll have a funeral. We'll have a wake. People will call upon, someone who's had a death loss. But if you're living at home with someone that you're having to arrange caregiving, there's no ritual in place. There's really nothing that guides people. And a lot of people disappear because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, or they don't know what to offer, or they feel overwhelmed as well. So there's a lot of isolation that goes into these losses too. So this is a picture. When I was a kid, I used to hold up a mirror, and I always kept trying to see to the end, mirror to a mirror. And this is a picture of that, holding up the mirror to the mirror to the mirror. And what I like about this image in non-finite loss is that a non-finite loss, you don't see an ending in sight. You can't, it just goes on. It just goes on, and all you can see is this is all that it is. It's just this loss is going to continue on and on and on. The researchers who actually first described non-finite loss said it's not infinite loss, it's not non-finite. They're very specific, it's non-finite because the loss is not contained. The loss is ongoing. So these are losses that are ongoing in nature. There's no foreseeable end. This is it now, you're in it. There's a response called chronic sorrow, which is very specific to these types of losses, and it's a form of grief, but it's different than grief after the death of a loved one. But it's really important to start thinking about what is chronic sorrow. And as you can think about, you're chronically grieving, you're chronically in sorrow, not because you're in chronic grief in a pathological sort of sense. You're in chronic sorrow because the loss is ongoing. So the grief is ongoing because the loss continues, right? So profound, continuing, recurring loss or reminders that you're dealing with a loss. The grief is ongoing. It's called a living loss. So it's a very different experience than we look at bereavement, which is the grief after the death of a loved one. Now you may think of the death of your life as you once knew it, the death of your loved one as you once knew your loved one, the death of yourself as you once knew yourself to be, the death of life as you pictured it to be. Those are all deaths that are happening. They're often not recognized, but you know exactly when these deaths are happening, and you're grieving at the same time you're having to deal with what's in front of you as well. So there's many examples of non-finite loss, not just Alzheimer's and dementia. There's many examples of chronic sorrow. Certainly chronic degenerative conditions, people with rheumatoid arthritis, people with multiple sclerosis, irreversible and progressive loss of capacity or functionality, which many of you are nodding. You can relate to that as well. Lifelong mental health issues. I have many of the adult learners in my program who are dealing with their grown children or their adolescent children who've been diagnosed with mental health issues, and recognizing that the vision they held for their children to grow into adults is now completely and radically different from what they hoped and thought it was going to be. So the loss of vocation, calling, or faith. And these are not things you have a control over. When I worked London Interfaith Counseling Center downtown, I can't tell you how many times I would have priests come in to talk after they were leaving the priesthood, because their parish communities often couldn't understand why they had left. They felt abandoned. And at the same time, these priests were struggling with themselves and why they had dedicated their whole life to their vocation, which now felt empty. So this was a big piece for many of them. So your loss of roles. So one of the more common things I have with my clients who come in to see me related to issues around dementia is sexuality. That when you're caregiving somebody and you're no longer your spouse, but you've become kind of the parent, and yet your partner may still reach out to you sexually, but it feels like a violation because you've become the parent. And then the guilt that goes with that. And people don't talk well about this stuff. You know, it's just hard to talk about. But often there's a real conflict here of, oh, well, I want to make him feel better. I want him to be happy. I want her to feel close to me, but then feeling a violation that, you know, you've kind of become this person's parent instead of their equal partner. And so it doesn't feel right either. And how do you talk about that with somebody? That's a really hard topic. I'll talk about George. So George is a fictional client. This is a compilation of several different experiences, but George is an 88-year-old man who has lived independently for many years. His wife died 20 years ago. He's very involved in the community. He's involved in the Hospice Foundation Board, and he enjoys playing bingo once a week. George drives, and he has his driver's license. George has adult children who live nearby. One day they met him for dinner, and they noticed that George pulled in the parking space and just barely missed nicking the car that was next to the parking space where he pulled in. So they mentioned to him about, Dad, did you not see the car? Oh, no, I had plenty of space. And they went and looked, no. So then they noticed another day one of them was driving with George. He went to go to the grocery store, and they went with him, and he ran a red light. And they said, oh my God, Dad, did you not see the red light? Oh, that wasn't a red light. You know, fine, nobody, you know. So very defensive, and the kids started realizing that George wasn't processing information like he should be to drive. And one of them thought maybe it's just me. Then they started all talking and realized that all of them were refusing to drive with him, that they were trying to meet him close to home so he wasn't driving, and nobody had talked about this, that George really was not safe to drive. And the decision amongst the siblings was, who's going to talk to Dad about this? So the oldest boy decided he would talk with George and his dad about their concerns. And George got very upset, attacked his son and said, you're just, you know, trying to take this away from me. You don't understand. I'm fine. You're worrying about nothing. And he got very upset with his son. And the son went back and said, okay, that went really well. So what eventually happened was all three of the siblings, all three of the children, sat down with George and tried to do this in the most loving way possible and say, Dad, this is what happened when I was with you. Dad, I've noticed this. I'm really worried. And at first he thought they were all ganging up on him, and he refused to hear it until one day he actually did have an accident. Luckily nobody was hurt, where he actually ran into a telephone pole. So what happened was George's insurance rate went sky high because they put two and two together that here was a man in his 80s who had had some minor infractions and now had a major accident. So they were seeing him as an issue. And George began to explore the possibility of maybe alternate forms of transportation begrudgingly, but mostly because the insurance company was ranking up his rates. Now in Florida, they have a law where after you get a certain age, you have your license checked, you have to go in for a driver's test. And in Florida also, family members are culpable. If they're aware that a family member is not fit to drive and they don't make an issue or they don't report it, then they're held to be liable as well if an accident does happen. So it kind of puts pressure on the families. But this kind of discussion is a really hard one to have. At what point do you have this discussion? For George, this was his life. It was his independence. It was, you know, his ability to still be a free agent. For his kids, it was a nightmare because they were so afraid of disenfranchising and having conflict in the relationship with their dad, and they loved him dearly, but they all had visions of something terrible happening. One of them said, we're not going to lose Dad to cancer. Dad's going to go out with a bang and kill 3 people in the process, and I don't want to see that happen. So this was a common occurrence, and this is something that, you know, people of my generation right now are dealing with our aging parents. So if you go back to looking at some of the main features of non-finite loss and chronic sorrow, you realize that at a certain point in time, this is now your life, okay? You're in it. This is where the glass has now shattered and you realize you can't put it back together again. You're in it now for a lifetime. This is now your life. And there's a big disparity. There's a big difference between what you hoped for and what you planned for versus the reality of what's sitting in front of you now. And you're having to try to come to terms with that. And maybe resentfully that this doesn't seem fair, it doesn't seem right. And how could this be the way it is? But there's a big disparity between what you'd hoped for versus reality of what's really happening. I think one of the big pieces here is that anxiety is the undercurrent. When you have a loss related to someone dying, there's usually a great deal of sadness, often anger as well, but the sorrow is kind of what takes over. When you're dealing with non-finite loss, it's the anxiety. You know, the litany of the day, am I going to be able to handle today? Okay, I got through today, now what? What's going to happen tonight? What's going to happen tomorrow? Am I going to be enough? Are we going to be able to handle this? You know, but the undercurrent of anxiety is really what separates grief and non-death loss from grief after the death of a loved one. And the anxiety piece for some people is really difficult. And it's also difficult for friends who, you know, try to reach out to you because the anxiety piece is there. It keeps you constantly going, and they don't know what to do with that either. And if you've ever been in a room where people are anxious, it's palpable, and it's you feel it, and people don't know what to do with that. So it's a big piece of what happens. On top of that, your support system becomes exhausted. You're tired, but the people who have been around you now realize this is for the long haul, and they become tired too. So what happens? They call less. My client, whose husband is young, he had business friends that used to take him out to lunch and that would come to visit, and now they don't know what to do with him because he can't engage the way he used to. They can't talk about sports, they can't talk about business because he looks at them and doesn't quite follow all the conversation, but he is lonely a lot of the time. So for his friends who have, you know, up to this point been reaching out to him, now they really don't know what to do with him. So they've come by less, they get called less. My client, who is his wife, looks at me and says, okay, now what? You know, now what do I do? And it used to be that in her parish, people would kind of sign up and kind of come over, and now that's become less and less. People are getting tired, and it's hard to find the support there. The next piece I want to talk about is ambiguous loss. And many of you might have already heard about ambiguous loss. This is a concept that was originally described by Dr. Pauline Boss from the University of Minnesota. She began working on ambiguous loss in the 1990s or so. Why ambiguous loss really came to the forefront was after the events of September 11th, where all the missing persons occurred. She was called in to be one of the supports to the families and to the professionals that were involved because of her work in ambiguous loss. So an ambiguous loss is, you know, it's typically a loss where the actual loss might not be clear or evident. I don't know if you remember after September 11th, people were carrying around pictures. Have you seen this person? Have you seen my loved one? Because they didn't know. They didn't know what had happened to their loved ones. Some of them later would have given anything just for a ring, for a piece of genetic material, for a piece of clothing, just to have confirmation. And many of them, probably the majority, never got that. So in their minds, you know, they saw what happened. There's no way somebody could have lived through that, but in their hearts, it's never really clear because they never really had proof that that's what happened. So there's two dynamics, and ambiguous loss is always about relationships. It's always in the concept of a relationship. So in the first aspect of ambiguous loss, the person is psychologically present but physically absent. So you think about adoptive mothers who gave up their babies for adoption but always think about that baby they gave up. So that baby is always on their mind and in their hearts but not physically present. The same thing with people who are missing in action. That the person that's missing you still love, you still think about, they're still very much emotionally present with you but physically they're absent. So those are examples of that type of ambiguous loss. The type of ambiguous loss that's probably more common to why we're here tonight is where the person is psychologically absent but physically present. And this is what makes it really hard because the person's still there. You know, they're still physically right there, but cognitively, emotionally, they're not the same. You've lost the person that was that person, even though physically they're sitting there right in front of you. So people often don't recognize that you're dealing with daily loss because you're saying goodbye even as you're caretaking, even as you're looking at this for a long time to come maybe. It's not being recognized much. So these are some of the other examples. Pauline's original work in Ambiguous Loss was about workaholism, where she would have, because she's a family therapist, so she would have families describing situations where maybe an example was the husband would work long hours, come home, eat dinner with the TV on, and then go upstairs and be on the computer. And so the family would be considered intact, and yet he's really absent. So even though he's physically present, physically providing, bringing in the income, working, emotionally and cognitively, he's absent. So that was her initial work. And I think that's very helpful for when I'm doing some family work. We have these situations where somebody's really checked out emotionally, but they're showing up physically. And so people assume he's a good provider, he's still there, not realizing that the dynamic in the home, he's gone, he's absent. And this is a profound loss and a profound issue for some homes, and it's hard to describe what actually is going on. The physical absence with the psychological presence, so you think about one of the more common ones is probably the non-custodial parents who lose contact with their children. That these are your children, you have an attachment bond with them, and yet you have no contact with them. And sometimes through the family court system, these kinds of things can happen. And there's a huge loss for the non-custodial parents and grandparents often who lose contact with a grandchild that they've loved dearly, or grandchildren. So I'll talk about Margaret. Margaret's a 78-year-old woman. Her husband, Harry, died 5 years ago. Margaret lived in the marital home. She kept it up even after Harry died. They'd lived in the home for 40 years. And they did everything together. They traveled together. They went to Florida every winter. And they danced together. They did stuff together. They were very close. They had 3 adult children. And Margaret gradually began to just feel more forgetful, and she thought it was just stress because she'd lost Harry. And the grown children didn't even really think about it because they just assumed it was Mom's grief over the loss of Dad. And they actually helped to get some caregiving in the home, somebody to come do cleaning, somebody to help her with some meals. And she began to get more forgetful. So they realized that Mom was not showing up for appointments, not showing up for dinners when they had planned to have dinner together. And it progressed to the point that they realized Mom was really not functioning all that well, until one day one of the grown daughters came in and was trying to help her mom find something, and she realized that she'd opened up an underwear drawer and there was dirty underwear in that drawer with excrement on it, and Mom had just stuffed it in the drawer. And she went, oh, something's really going on here. So they had the CCAC come in and check on her. They had her assessed with the family doctor, who said maybe early Alzheimer's, we're not sure. But it progressed very quickly to the point that the caregivers they brought in, now Margaret began to accuse them of stealing things when she couldn't find things that she had misplaced. And she became very paranoid that the people coming into her home were actually taking things from her or were talking about her with other people. And it got to the point where the caregiver, the agency, called the one adult child who was the primary caregiver and said, we can't go in the home anymore. She's become violent with us. She's accusing. Nobody wants to go there. And so they gradually had this meeting with the family and had Margaret reassess, this time with the neurologist. And it was decided that maybe it was best for Mom to go into assisted living and to have somebody around her all the time. This is a very familiar scenario, right? So Margaret was in the assisted living for about a year, and she gradually stopped eating, and she began picking on some of the other residents, and she latched romantically onto one of the male residents. This didn't go over well with his family. They were a Mennonite family. She was talking about buying nighties for him and getting a nice new bed for them to share, and he was oblivious to her, but the family was not, so they had to move Margaret to another place, and Margaret finally had to go into full care because she really could not take care of herself and she couldn't track things. 3 months after Margaret was in full care, she kind of fell asleep in her wheelchair and died. So the children were notified. They all came in and planned a funeral for Margaret, and and this was a close family, so they had talked all along about what was happening, many phone calls with each other, many family meetings. And in this meeting where they were talking about Margaret's funeral, one of the daughters said, you know, we lost Mom a long time before we just lost Mom, but I can't put my finger on when that really happened, but we lost Mom a long time ago. And we've really been grieving Mom all this time, and now we finally get to have a funeral to really remember all the good things about Mom, because all we've been thinking about is all the difficult stuff. And they all nodded and said, yeah, that's what it is. He says, at what point do you start grieving these losses? And when are you allowed to actually have your grief over these losses? Oops. So what's unique about ambiguous loss is they lack clarity. It's hard sometimes to put your finger exactly on what's been lost. And this might be a moving target. It's like one day it may be, okay. One day it might go pretty smoothly, and then the next 3 days might be awful, and nothing is going right, and losing track of all sorts of things, and then having a good day. So you never know. And people showing up get snippets of your life, and they don't really have an idea of what this is like on an in and out, day-by-day basis. They talk about being frozen. So this feeling of being frozen in your experience, being frozen in the grief, because the person is still with you, and yet you're grieving, but you don't know if this is going to change. You're trying to conserve. You're trying to last it out as long as you can, and you get frozen in this particular type of loss and this type of grief. People talk about, I can't move forward, I can't make plans, I don't know what tomorrow holds, I know I love this person, but this person changes from day to day, so I don't really know who this person is on some days. So what happens too with the support network is that because of the uncertainty around what's happening and the unpredictability, people can't count on you also to show up when you might want to be there. You kind of lose track of the regular maybe coffee klatch meeting. You maybe lose track of the work roles that you once had, or co-workers, or the people that were in your network, maybe in your parish community. One of the things that a couple of my clients describe is they like to go to their church service or to their synagogue, but who's going to be with their loved one so they can go? And they've been told, oh, bring him, bring her. And they think, no, I'm going to spend the whole time worrying about what's going to happen. So they're in a limbo place with being able to engage versus not engage. And they never know for sure if they really can. So you make plans, but you never know if you're going to be able to fulfill them. And often people don't understand that. So there's an overlap. So you can think about, it's not this is non-finite loss, this is chronic sorrow, and this is ambiguous loss. It's kind of jumbled up, and you're dealing with lots of different things, and there's overlaps. So you'll have an overlap of non-finite loss with the ambiguity of being frozen. So the anxiety of the roller coaster experience happening and the unpredictability comes along then with the ambiguity of what you're really dealing with, and then the chronic sorrow kind of covers a lot of that in terms of the day-by-day, what I call the litany of the day. And it's very real and often very much unrecognized. So I make a distinction then between what we call tangible losses and intangible. The tangible losses are the ones that are obvious. My client who has the husband with Parkinson's has talked about that physically he hasn't really looked like he's been that much affected until just recently. The average person looking at him wouldn't think anything about it. He could be talking and nobody would really know that he wasn't himself, and now he's starting to demonstrate physically some of the symptoms. But she would say it would be very difficult because people come up and talk to him and talk to me not having a clue that he really had no idea what they were saying and couldn't process any of what they were trying to share with him. The intangible losses are the ones you can't see. The ones that are just as real, but they're not obvious. They're not something that you can show on the outside. It's not the loss of a limb. It's not a treatment that's really obvious. These are the intangible, unseen losses. And they're both real. They're both important. And they both happen. It's the intangible losses that don't get recognized, but those are the ones that often causes the biggest struggle, because it's the long haul and the difficulty along the way. So these are just kind of a summary of, the non-finite losses, that the undercurrent of anxiety separates it from grief after the death of a loved one. The ongoing loss, you're constantly having to accommodate, constantly trying to keep up with what's happening. The supports get exhausted, and often people don't understand what's going on. And there's social discomfort because people don't know how to respond when it's ambiguous. They really don't know what to say. And so often they pull away, causing more isolation. Okay. So I think some losses are obvious and some aren't, and both can have a big impact on our lives in a very real way. Okay. I'm going to talk about maybe some suggestions. Maybe I'm not going to have huge words of wisdom. There's no aha here. You know, none of us can say, oh, that made me feel so much better, thank you. And I think that's where people want to be able to say something to us that is going to make us say, oh, thank you, that makes me feel so much better. You know, really what makes us feel the most better is feeling that we're understood, or that we actually are heard, or that somebody really just cares, because you can't take it away. Nobody can say something that's going to say, oh, I feel so much better now, because they can't take away the situation. So often people don't try because they know that there's nothing they can say. We devalue our ability to just be fully present to somebody else, just listening, just being there. But the psychological stress, these are the critical factors: loss of control, loss of predictability, loss of outlets for frustration. I can remember when I was taking care of my mom, there was one day when my mom was she was a very social creature, and I'm more introverted. But I'd gotten her the phone, I'd helped her to dial the numbers for her friends, I planned her breakfast, she'd eaten, I'd done her hair, and it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I still hadn't had my breakfast yet. And she asked me to please get the phone and call up another friend. And I looked at her, and I don't remember exactly what I said, but at the moment I said it, I wish I hadn't. You know, it was one of those. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and I ran out of the room and hated myself for the rest of the day. And when I came back later that night, she said, honey, this is hard on you. And she goes, I know that you have a life and that you're giving it up right now for me. She said, you know, thank you. And I was lucky because my mom had the wherewithal to say that. Many of you don't get that, right? But it still it's still real. So the underlying theme is that you have to adapt to erratically changing versions of yourself and the person that you love as well. And that's constantly changing. Constantly standing on shifting sand. And I think it gets to a point in time where it's the friends and family members that really start to suffer. There's a point in time often, you know, there's that anxiety period where people know something is wrong with them. They know they're not thinking well. They know that something is not right. And that loss of control, and that loss of who I am, they're dealing with that. And there's another point of time where they do have the ability to kind of let that go, or it just happens. But you're not. You don't have that luxury. You don't have that privilege. You're still the one holding all of that. And I think that's really where the burden comes in. You're holding it all now. So here are some responses. So I had to learn to forgive myself with my mom. And our caregiving with my mom lasted about 18 months. But to be true to yourself, you know, that you're human, and none of us can be perfect. And in this situation, you're responding imperfectly to a very imperfect situation. But you're responding the best that you can, right? And there's limitations. You can only go so long without sleep, and you can only go so long without a break, and you can only go so long in isolation in this particular situation. So there are human limits that are just real, and that we try to push those. And the more you push without being able to recognize these limitations, the more they'll come back and bite you. So it's recognizing, not because it's something wrong with you, but something right. You know, these are not limitations in a bad way. These are just human limitations because we are human and we're not robots. If I was a robot, I could just do this. If I was a computer, I would do this, but I also wouldn't have feelings, and I wouldn't be capable of caring or loving. So the community resources, you're all here tonight, many of you watching on web streaming, so you're making yourself available to some of the resources. And there are many resources now available in the community for support and education. Find them. Find whatever you can. Use every ounce of it that you can find. And I think, you know, you find there's strengths, that some of us have different strengths than others. Like with my sister and I could do the bed, bath, and daily care. She couldn't do that. I got flustered by trying to do all the coordination and the billing and all that. In the States, we had to do all of that stuff because we didn't have health coverage. So you had to do it through insurance and all sorts of piecemeal together. And she was really good at that. And so rather than saying, oh, I feel like I've got the whole burden of caregiving on me, we actually were able to kind of divide it and see that these were our strengths. And so we could use our strengths to identify the places that we could do the best work and where we could offer the best care. And then I think a big piece is isolation. I think it's particularly harmful that down the road you will re-enter life. Down the road, right now, this is how it is, but it's not always going to be this way, and we don't know what the future holds. But if the future holds the re-entry back into the world has been moving while you have been frozen. So find ways to try to connect into that world if you can. Find ways to somehow stay networked in ways that are possible so that you don't have the big gap when life comes back to you that you don't know what to do and you're lost as you try to re-enter. That's another loss experience as well. So one of the things I often will talk to my clients about is, okay, what's possible? What's possible for you to stay connected even in small ways? What's possible for you to maybe go out to coffee for an hour? What's possible for you to maybe go do volunteer at the school for just this little bit? How can you at least get yourself so that you're not losing all of that in the process if possible? Okay. So this is NATO. Now, many of us have an idea of what NATO actually is, but I learned this just very recently, and I like it. Not attached to outcome. So what's most important on a day-by-day basis is not whether or not what you do is worth it or what the response actually is so much as your intention. That if your intention is to be as fully present as you can to your loved one and to yourself, that's all you can ask of yourself. Whether or not that works in a practical way, you'll adjust. NATO. So at this moment, I plan to be fully present in this particular moment, what's most important to myself, to my loved one, to my family, and I'm not going to look down the road and get myself overwhelmed by that. I reel that in, not because I don't plan, but because I get overwhelmed, and that adds to my stress. So we don't do this really well. We're not taught to live in the moment very well in our society. We're planners. We talk about the long-term plan, talk about RSPs, all this other stuff. Think about what you want for your future, and that's all crap. Okay. So, that's all gone by the wayside anyway. If you look down the road, that can be scary. So you look down the road when you need to. So one of the things I will tell my clients who are caregivers, think about, down the road, you might be looking at placement, start getting some information about that. But in the meantime, today is today. So what is today? And what is today going to hold? And keep bringing that into the here and now. And that's a real hard practice. Breathe. Take a breath. You're here. Everything's okay. In this moment, you're breathing. So it's a hard practice, and it is a practice of having to do that on a daily basis, hourly even, that in this moment, I'm okay. In this moment, I'm here. In this moment, we're all right. Okay, I can't predict what the next moment's going to be, but in this moment, okay, we're here. So, we go through life and we often think it's going to be static. We often think we know what life's going to hold, and all of us in this room now know, no, that's not how it was planned to be, and life is now unfolding in ways we never thought could be possible. So is it possible that even as we hold on and love the people that are in our lives, can we also let go? Let go of expectations. Let go of the plans that we so dearly held on to. Let go of how it should be. And for right now, just be with it. So the language of letting go is a really hard one for all of us. We're not taught this language. We're taught to fight the good fight and struggle. And people are often touted very positively because they fought the good fight. What are you fighting? What are you really fighting? And if you're fighting, is that going to make a difference? Fighting uses a lot of energy. So what is possible to accept even as you work around? It's a dynamic of letting go and holding on at the same time. I think the language of loss, we don't really think about this, but you think about. So those of us who have children, you think about the moment they took their first steps and you realize they're now independent. I don't have to carry them everywhere. They don't need me for all of that. The moment they start feeding themselves. I remember taking my daughter to grade 1, and it was the first time she's going to be in all-day school. And I thought, oh my gosh, that precious time we've had during the day is gone now, right? And I laughed because she went running into the classroom. She was thrilled. I went back to the car and cried. So, but it's letting go. My daughter's now a teenager. You talk about letting go big time, right? I don't know a lot about her life like I used to. We learn to let go. We let go through moving. We let go through relationships changing. Divorce happens. Life happens. Things occur. And so many of us have experienced many, many kinds of loss, and we've grown and changed and adapted as we've needed to each of these losses. So loss is really a part of who we are. It's what shaped who we are. There's no different now. The loss is prolonged. The losses are ongoing. But still the language of loss and the potential for loss to shape us in ways we can't plan is still very much there too. So thank you.